Welcome to Ion Connecticut. I'm Mike Savino. Schools around the country started moving towards zero tolerance policies in the mid 1990s as a way to try to maintain discipline in the classroom. But some students have unfairly felt the brunt of these policies, leading to a push since then to end this so-called school to prison pipeline. Here to talk more about the impact of these policies and the efforts to undo them is Laura Ruth, Research and Policy Director for the Connecticut Voices for Children. Laura, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So you're the Connecticut Voices for Children. You were part of a report that the organization put out back in May of 2020. And so just to start the conversation, I mean, help us put into context sort of this issue of this school to prison pipeline. Define the problem. What is it? And sort of what is the scope of it here in Connecticut?
Sure. So Connecticut Voices for Children has a 20 plus year history of working on issues surrounding exclusionary discipline and children and youth in Connecticut's justice system. And the state as a whole has made a lot of progress in keeping kids engaged at school so that they can access college and access fruitful careers, and also working really hard to reduce the number of children who are entering the criminal legal system, which we know can result in long-lasting trauma for young people and result in long-term negative consequences like housing insecurity, poverty, and cycling in and out of the criminal legal system. But at the same time, while Connecticut's made tremendous strides reducing the use of exclusionary discipline and school-based arrests, we also know that deep disparities in the use of these policies and practices continues to exist. Additionally, deep disparities in children's engagement and achievement at school exist, with approximately 2 times the percent of Black and Latinx children not being proficient in reading and math compared to white children, and 3 times more likely not to graduate on time. So the disparities in Connecticut related to exclusionary discipline and achievement are greater than in the nation as a whole. During the 2019-2020 school year, I just pulled up a few more recent numbers. The suspension rate for Black students was 3.6 times higher than the suspension rate for white students. And the suspension rate for Latinx students was 2.4 times higher than for white students. The disparities for school-based arrests are even higher, and young people of color make up the vast majority of children in Connecticut's criminal legal system, particularly for those at the deep end of the system within secure facilities such as the Manson Youth Justice Institute, run by the Department of Corrections.
So why, I mean, you mentioned, Connecticut has made progress, in generally trying to end these policies. Why are we still seeing these disparities?
So that's what this paper was seeking to try and unearth. We know that as exclusionary discipline is reducing, there's been a lot of good done, but it doesn't seem to have to fix the entire problem. So there was more going on than just changing policy school by school. And there's more than individual kids' behaviors. And schools are really feeling strained right now. A lot of teachers are talking about feeling like they don't have support for behavior in schools, feeling like their kids are coming in with higher levels of need than they used to, feeling like their classrooms are too big. So teachers are saying that they can't keep making changes to policy without adding support to their situation. So this paper was an attempt to reconceptualize the school to prison pipeline in an effort to figure out some of these other issues that are contributing to the pipeline and think through some of the solutions regarding ways to address these other issues.
And just before we go further, you're talking, obviously you looked at exclusionary discipline, help us define that. I mean, obviously we're aware of, for example, out of school suspensions, but what kinds of discipline are you looking at here?
So exclusionary discipline is a term that kind of bundles together a bunch of different types of discipline. So it can refer to in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, referrals to the police, and school-based arrests.
And what kind of supports are teachers asking for or advocates calling for as ways to maybe avoid that? I mean, you mentioned teachers saying we need more help with behavioral issues. What kind of supports are they looking for?
Right now, teachers seem to be fed up and they'll take whatever they can get. But when we really sit down and talk about the problem, most teachers would prefer more support for kids with behavioral health needs and smaller class sizes. So we know that Connecticut is extremely underfunded in terms of the number of counselors in schools, the number of social workers in schools, and other behavioral and mental health supports that meet not only the child's needs, but the family's needs, and really contribute to a healthy ecosystem for families and for schools. Other schools are starting to implement policies such as restorative justice policies and school-based diversion, which is run out of the Connecticut, the Children's, CHDI. I always forget exactly what that stands for, the Children's Health Disparities or Health and Development Institute. So we're seeing some schools take proactive action to really try and meet their kids where they are without sending them out of the classroom. But when schools don't feel like they have enough supports to help them do that, teachers still rely on sending kids out of the classroom.
And sort of what is the hope with having these supports? I guess, one of the questions that I'm sure parents would have is, how should we be disciplining these kids if not in their mind, tried and true way of suspending them, of letting them know that they've done wrong? I mean, how do we envision an alternative, whether it's restorative justice or working with a counselor? How would that then sort of correct behavior?
So I think it's going to take a little bit of a mind shift. Well, not a little, it's going to take a lot of a mind shift in terms of what the problems are and how to actually address them. So on the one hand, there's the how do you address it for the child, which you brought up. And so restorative practices are, when they're implemented well, they really take an entire shift in how you think about community and how you think about relationships, and how children understand where they fit into those things. So it's about not just punishing the child who did wrong. It actually doesn't punish that child. Rather, it helps the child take accountability for the collateral consequences of their behaviors and to restore those relationships. Hence the name restorative justice. So it's really about helping the child build what they need to want to serve and work with others in a way that's pro-social, and to understand what the child's needs are that contributed and help the community really hold the child and help meet that child's needs. So it sees interactions as bi-directional rather than a single perpetrator and victim. It really looks at the ecosystem of how that happened and what's needed to not just restore, but actually make the ecosystem better for everyone involved. On the other hand, when we talk about children's behaviors, there's a lot of causes for those behaviors where others are not taking accountability. So one of the things that our paper goes into is that a lot of the children who are being pushed out of schools are facing deep discrimination on a regular basis, and it's often not conscious. And it isn't necessarily mean-spirited, but the stereotypes that we use to guide how we behave with others can be deeply hurtful to how teachers and administrators and entire systems treat individual children. So it goes beyond learning about racial stereotypes and really understanding the intersectionality of children's identities and what they're bringing to school and how we may treat children differently based on our own thoughts about those intersectional identities. We see some of this pop up in the fact that exclusionary discipline is on the rise for Black girls. And I think a lot of that has to do with that unique intersectional stereotype for not just Black children, but specifically Black girls, in trying to fit them into the stereotype about what girls are supposed to be like. And so the actual training and support that teachers and administrators in schools need to reform individual ways of responding to children, as well as systemic policies, it needs to go deeply beyond what is currently offered, and it needs to be ongoing. One anti-racism training is not going to actually fix these problems that are driven less so by the children and more so by the adults that they come in contact with.
Could hiring practices also address that problem?
Absolutely. Connecticut has been working for a number of years to increase the teachers they attract who are people of color and who are people that come from the communities where the children and their families come from. Hiring teachers and administrators that really understand the communities and can connect with children can not only entirely set children's trajectory on a totally different path and really increase academic achievement and engagement at schools, but it also helps teachers to understand what the parents are doing and helps the parents to advocate for their children. But it's a slow going process. Teachers in Connecticut are just not paid enough, frankly, and don't have enough supports to make it a career that's an option for everyone who might be otherwise interested.
You brought it up just in your remarks a couple of minutes ago, and also in the report. It lays out not just the issue of what Black and Latinx students face, but you also break it down by gender, and you also break it down by whether or not students identify as LGBTQ+. Why is that important? And do those things take different approaches, different solutions? And why is it important to sort of note gender differences, gender identity differences, as well as racial differences?
So I mentioned a little bit before, each person carries stereotypes with them that they may unintentionally use just to be able to respond more quickly in any given moment, because we have a lot of, my apologies, from my background as a psychologist, people carry a lot of biases that are not necessarily good things or bad things, but they're just quick heuristics for dealing with moments where we have a ton of information coming in at any given time, where we need to take it in, filter it through, and respond. And so stereotypes are a way of responding to that quickly. And as I mentioned, stereotypes work in a way that's intersectional, and people's identities are intersectional. So we find that the way teachers interact with white boys is different from how they interact with white girls. We find that how teachers interact with white LGBTQ+ boys is different from how they interact with white LGBTQ+ girls, etc. We carry really deep stereotypes. Most people carry very deep stereotypes about race and gender and sexual orientation and how people present based on that. And sometimes these are deeply moral beliefs. And even when people are trying to work on that, without a lot of work and a lot of support and a lot of awareness, and others offering where they see these behaviors being different to different children, it can be really hard to know exactly when any individual is actually discriminating. As I said, unintentionally in many cases, and due to this really complex psychological system of stereotypes and biases. But also these identities impact what children bring with them to school, and they impact how children are able to connect with their teachers and administrators. And so it impacts every aspect of the kid's experience, both good and bad. And so really helping teachers to provide to understand where they're coming from and the choices they're making and how those choices may differ from child to child is really important. And it's important to help understand what the kids' needs are when they show up in school. And sometimes that need can be that they really need a place where they can connect with other children who are like them. Sometimes it's that they don't feel safe at home. Sometimes it's that they had trauma in their neighborhood 2 days before. And all of these are issues that intersect with kids differently.
One area that gets a lot of focus when we talk about discipline in schools and the need for possible reforms is school resource officers. And we're seeing a push from some who want to see them removed from all schools, but schools that have them see them as a source of safety. And even the resource officers will argue that, they can, if we change the way we use them, they can be a source of, teaching positive interactions between police and kids. Should we be getting rid of school resource officers, re-envisioning how they use them, or how do they fit in this going forward?
Thank you. This is a really important question. The year prior to when our school to prison pipeline paper was released, we released a paper looking at the data on school resource officers in Connecticut, utilizing data from the Civil Rights Data Collection, which is a federal data source, in the 2015-2016 school year. So our data is a little out of date, but looking across that year, when we explored schools that had school resource officers versus schools that didn't, and we statistically adjusted for some other factors that might impact school discipline, we found that in schools with school resource officers, the risk of children being arrested or referred to law enforcement was much greater than in schools without school resource officers. And that was across child race. When we actually statistically controlled for the extent to which some other variables might account for these differences. So we know that big schools are more likely to have school resource officers. When we control for school size, when we control for school demographics, when we controlled for school socioeconomic status, controlling for multiple other variables, we found that there was unique variance in the arrest rates, specifically for Latinx children, but also at a greater extent for Black children, in terms of these children experiencing more arrests, a greater percentage of arrests, and referrals to law enforcement in that wasn't explained by these other factors, but was statistically related to the presence of school resource officers. So then we tried also looking at some of the possible good outcomes that we heard brought up, like school resource officers make kids feel safer and therefore will contribute to more positive academic outcomes. But we didn't find differences in positive academic outcomes. And we also tried digging into the actual school incidents, so things happening in schools. How many times has a weapon come across the grounds? How many times has someone reported a theft? And we didn't find differences in these actual incidences based on the presence of a school resource officer or not. So we didn't find any evidence that school resource officers are making schools either measurably safer or resulting in the increased academic achievement that we would expect children to feel and experience if they felt safer. But we did find really stark really stark differences in children being sent to police and arrested in the schools. So we at Voices advocate that schools really should be addressing these issues with more counseling staff and more social work staff who are well equipped with tools to improve school climate and to help understand kids' families and help meet family needs, rather than investing in more police in schools.
So should that also mean getting school resource officers out of schools altogether, just getting away from that practice?
Yeah, I think the more we can equip schools with the behavioral health support staff they need and really move them towards understanding how these staff can help contribute to a positive school environment, we can certainly have fewer and fewer officers in schools. And that is what we would advocate for, that children really should be going to school feeling like school is a place for learning, not like school is a place for policing or punishment. And, for people that rightly say that some students do feel safer, we also know that nationally and based on a lot of sociological data, who feels safer differs by child. Children of color are less likely to say that they feel safer in schools with school resource officers than white children. And children who have experienced violence while they've been at school, so children who have been victims of bullying, children who have experienced a lot of exclusionary discipline at the hands of one teacher, these students also feel less safe at schools with school resource officers. So while not everyone is in agreement, it's going to be a matter of determining for the children we're trying to serve, what in this particular moment, what do those children need? And do children really need policing in schools? And our research suggests that they don't.
I also suggest people listen to a conversation we're going to have with a family about how this has affected them, talking about their own personal experiences with discipline in schools. Laura, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your time.